Order, order. I call Zara Sultana to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered arms export licences for sale to Israel. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Christopher. And I'm very pleased to have secured this timely debate and grateful to the House authorities for granting it. More than 18,000 Palestinians, including over 7,000 children killed. More than 80% of the population, 1.8 million people displaced. Almost 100 journalists killed, the highest in any global conflict in more than 30 years. And more than 100 UN aid workers killed, again, more than in any conflict in UN history. This weekend, the UN warned that half the population of Gaza is facing starvation. Mr. Chairman, behind these horrifying statistics are real people. People with names, hopes, dreams, families, friendships, just as real as yours and mine. And so I'd like to start this debate by talking about Noor, a 17-year-old student from a town just south of Gaza City who wanted to be a doctor when she left school. In a page recovered from her diary, Noor spoke of her hope to make her family proud. Noor was killed when an Israeli airstrike hit her home on the 11th of October. I'd also like to talk about 26-year-old Safa and her baby girl, Eliana, who were killed in their sleep when an Israeli fighter jet bombed their house in the southern city of Rafah. And then there's Reem, whose lifeless body was cradled by her grandfather after her family home in al-Nusra refugee camp was hit by a strike. Her grandfather, Khalid, stroked her hair and kissed her goodbye for the last time, pinning her earring to his jacket as a badge to remember her by. She was the soul of my soul, he said. But Mr. Chairman, the horror is so extreme, it would be impossible to talk about all the people indiscriminately killed. Just to list the names of all those who've been killed, let alone tell their stories, would nearly take 20 hours. And I say this because I want to remind my colleagues, I want to remind the House, because it seems like we need to remind everyone of the shared humanity of those being slaughtered in Gaza today. And I do this because whether we like it or not, this place is deeply complicit in the atrocities we are seeing being inflicted on the Palestinian people. Not only does the British government provide vital diplomatic support for Israel, most recently joining the US as lone voices, refusing to call for a ceasefire on the UN Security Council, a move that the US shamefully vetoed, but we also supply the Israeli military with hundreds of millions of pounds worth of arms. The true figure actually is shrouded in secrecy. Though what we do know is from open export licenses, where arms companies can export an unlimited quantity of specified equipment with no further monitoring and no tracking of their total value. Yes.
So, Christopher, my friend is making an excellent speech, and she's absolutely right to ask the question as to why the UK abstained on the vote in the United Nations. But the point she now makes about arms exports is that, of course, we never can find out what arms exports have left this country and gone to Israel. Isn't it about time we had transparency in this arms trade?
Absolutely. And I'll go on to talk about the bill that I have presented to the House, but that's what this debate is about. It's about getting the government to commit to ending these arms licenses so that we are not complicit in war crimes. So, open export licenses, arms companies can export an unlimited quantity of specified equipment, no further monitoring, no tracking of their total value. But what we do track is called closed export licenses, and we know that the government has handed arms licenses to the Israeli government worth £700 and £474 million since 2015. Yes.
She mentioned that the UK government, and I thank her for securing this powerful debate, she mentioned that the UK government have a closed licence with Israel. The criteria for outlining who can receive arms export licences from the government includes strong wording in relation to violence against women and girls. Does she agree with me that we need to ensure that any arms exported from this country are not used to facilitate unlawful military action?
I thank my colleague for that intervention. We do have a licensing regime, but there are loopholes that are often exploited, and that's what we're seeking to address. Yes. Sure.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who is making an excellent speech, and in particular quite rightly highlights the humanitarian nightmare that people in Gaza are facing. Does she agree with me that it's an absolute duty on our government, as it is on other governments, that where arms or components used in arms are used in violation of international law and to commit war crimes, then there must be an immediate suspension and a review?
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Just to go back, we know that we have licensed arms licenses to the Israeli military worth £474 million since 2015, and included in these licenses are parts of F-35 fighter jets, that stealth aircraft that are currently unleashing hell on Gaza. According to US arms company Lockheed Martin, who are the lead contractor for these jets, they are, and I quote, the most lethal fighter jets in the world. And in British factories, 15% of parts for these aircraft are made, including at a factory in Brighton, which makes the weapon release system on the jet, allowing it to unleash deadly airstrikes on the people below. So we have to ask the question, was it a British-made release system that sent death screaming onto Safa and her baby girl in Rafah? Was Noor robbed of her dream of becoming a doctor because a British-made weapon fired an airstrike on her home? And were British-made arms involved in robbing Khalid of his beautiful granddaughter? The answer is we don't know, because there is no doubt that British-made arms have been used in the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. And in spite of hollow protestations of government ministers, there is also no doubt that Israel has committed clear violations of international law, as the UN Secretary-General, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and others have said. I give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I thank her also for bringing this debate today and allowing us the opportunity to call for a halt in arms sales to Israel. She will be alarmed, like many of us in this House, at the stance of the UK government, who say that they believe that Israel should adhere to international law, and yet take no action and make no statement when the evidence mounts up that Israel is not doing so. Does she agree with me that halting arms sales can be proven that they are not used as part of war crimes, that would be a practical step the government could take, and it would increase its credibility when it mouths pious words about international law?
I agree with my honourable friend on that. British credibility has been damaged, especially by the vote that we had at the UN Security Council to show true leadership, moral leadership. This is an important step that I hope that the government will take. Sure.
I thank her for the powerful speech and very important speech that she's given. And I also want to put on record the name of Professor Refat Al-Arir, who was a colleague of my constituent, Professor Alison Phipps. He was her Gazan link to the work that she does in working with refugees from Gaza. And he sadly lost his life in an airstrike. But the problem is that by the UK continuing to supply weapons to Israel at the moment, we've talked about breaches of international law, the UK then becomes complicit in these breaches of international law. And that puts us in a very difficult position.
Absolutely, and to be true partners calling for peace, we can't be arming one side of the conflict. We need to be securing a political settlement to the crisis, yes.
We're often told by ministers, and no doubt the Minister will make this point later in the debate, that we have one of the toughest arms export control regimes in the world, and yet we hardly ever see any evidence about how these tough rules are applied in practice. And I wonder whether that leaves her suspecting, as it leaves me suspecting, that this regime really is not what it's cracked up to be.
Thank you. Later on, I will touch on how we have previously halted arms sales to Israel when David Cameron led the government. So it has happened in the past, but the fact that we're not seeing it now makes you question. Many hands going up. I'll go to my colleague over there.
Way and for bringing this extremely important debate. She touched on the arms sales that have been continued over a number of years, and very much touching on the fact that actually the UK has continued to supply arms to Israel, thereby also being complicit, I believe, in the occupation of the West Bank and the arms that are used to suppress people there. And she said she was going to talk about the precedents that we have had for suspending arms sales, where it's clear that there are concerns of benefiting human rights violations. Would she agree with me that this could be very much like the time that the UK had an arms embargo on sales of arms to Israel from 1982 to 1984, following the UK invasion of Lebanon?
Yes, I agree that we've shown that we can take leadership in the past, although we did, in the example I mentioned before, when David Cameron stopped arms sales, we did resume them after, but on this occasion we can see that there are clear violations of international law taking place and we cannot continue arms sales. I will make a bit of progress. So, Mr. Chairman, what makes the government's refusal to suspend arms sales even more horrifying is that Israeli officials have been quite open about their intent in Gaza. At the beginning of the assault, an Israeli military spokesperson said the emphasis in bombing was on, and I quote, damage, not accuracy. Another official promised to turn Gaza, again I quote, into a city of tents, while the former head of the National Security Council said that the aim was to make Gaza, and again this is a direct quote, a place where no human being could exist. The National Security Minister said that the only thing that should enter Gaza, and I quote, is not a gram of humanitarian aid, but hundreds of tons of explosives. And more recently, an Israeli minister said that the war would be Gaza's Nakba, a reference to the 1948 catastrophe where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homes and never allowed to return. Mr. Chairman, with this stated intent and the actions that match it, UN experts have warned, and I quote, of a genocide in the making. So let us be clear. If this is a genocide in the making, British-made weapons are almost certainly part of making that genocide happen. Mr. Chairman, none of this is to deny or downplay Hamas's appalling attack on October the 7th, where 1,200 people and a majority of civilians were killed. I condemn that attack once again today, as I repeatedly have done in the chamber, again calling for the release of all hostages. And like I've also said before, echoing the words of the UN Secretary General, those crimes do not excuse what we have witnessed since. And unlike those awful crimes, Israel's assault on Gaza has been done with the government's unequivocal support and with British-made weapons. Disgracefully, selling arms for war crimes in Gaza is not new for British governments. Following Israel's Operation Protective Edge in 2014, which again human rights organisations said violated international law, the Conservative-led coalition government undertook an investigation of arms sales to Israel, finding that they could have been used by the Israeli military in Gaza and resulted in the government committing to suspend sales if Israel resumed its military assault.
Powerful speech, which is setting out the scale of this emergency. She's correct to say that almost 2 years ago, a UK minister said that UK export controls help ensure that controlled weapons are not used in the serious violation of international humanitarian law. Does she agree with me that the consolidated list are meaningless if arms continue to be exported to Israel in this context?
Absolutely, it's hollow words if there isn't any action. Following the 2008 to 2009 Gaza war, the then Labour government admitted that British-made arms had been used by Israel, prompting the then Foreign Secretary David Miliband to apologise and affirm that Israeli misuse of equipment would inform future licence applications. And the truth is, Mr. Chairman, that the current criteria for export licences should be enough to stop their sale. Under both UK and international law, the government is required to prevent the transfer of military equipment to a state if there is clear or overriding risk that it could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international law. That is what criteria 1 and 2 of the strategic export licensing criteria says. So if it was consistently applied, there would be a de facto arms embargo in Israel, since this military equipment is used to uphold Israel's military occupation of the Palestinian territories, including for infrastructure of the illegal West Bank settlements, which, of course, illegal under international law and according to UK policy, and for the transfer of prisoners from occupied territory into Israel, which the FCDO has noted as a violation of the Geneva Convention. I'll give way.
Member for Coventry South, and thank her for bringing the debate forward. And she has said that we don't know about the arms sales, and we indeed don't know. but somebody knows. And shouldn't we expect more of the companies that in the UK not to be like immoral drug dealers on the street corner selling to whoever, wherever, regardless of the consequences? The executives of these companies know, the companies themselves know, and shouldn't they show us all exactly what they're doing? Because we have to expect these companies that live amongst us in the UK not to be funding death and aiding and abetting death in Gaza, as is happening at the moment.
Thank you for that intervention. Amnesty International says, and I quote, "The arms licensing system is not fit for purpose in assessing risk. It is riddled with loopholes and in need of root and branch reform." That is why this week I introduced a new bill that would launch an inquiry into the use of arms sales sold to foreign states and suspend arms to any state that might use them in violation of international law.
Friend for giving way, but also for an excellent speech and for all that she's doing on this really important issue. And I associate my remarks with the very personal approach that she raised. I have a constituent whose partner is being, at this moment, bombed as he tries to get evacuated from South Gaza. But does she agree with me that in addition to the arms sales to Israel, we should be thinking also about the arms sales to the US, to Saudi Arabia and to many other countries, and ensure that we tighten the licensing arrangements for those countries, those arms manufacturers to those countries as well?
Absolutely. And since
this is a debate about arms sales to Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since getting elected, I have raised arms licenses to regimes like the Saudi regime who have used British-made weapons in Yemen, so I completely agree. And regarding the bill that I presented, it wouldn't just suspend sales to Israel, but also to the likes of Saudi Arabia, whose war in Yemen led to the death of thousands of people, again, with clear and well-documented violations of international law. And in another shameful disregard for human rights, this war was also facilitated by our government and so is linked to this debate, as export licenses to Saudi Arabia were worth a staggering £6.8 million since the beginning of the war, which is why I have repeatedly called for the House to suspend arms to Saudi Arabia. Mr. Chairman, ending this bloody exchange is just one of the... Yes.
I thank my friend for giving way, and she's making an absolutely excellent speech. Is she aware that only 2 weeks ago in the House, the Secretary of State for Defence claimed that sales to Israel in the past year were less than £50 million worth of arms? The figures she's given seem to suggest that he had misinformed himself before he made that statement. Does she have any idea of a credible figure of how much is sold to Israel, and also what the value is of Elbit Systems sales are, and how many of those sales are made internally with Elbit Systems back to Israel itself?
Like I mentioned earlier, a lot is shrouded in secrecy. What we do know is the value of 474 million, but we believe that that figure is much higher, and I think there needs to be true transparency, especially with the arms sales that are coming from this government. Mr. Chairman, ending this bloody exchange is one of the steps the government must take to end its complicity in the massacre in Gaza. Even as countries across the globe call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, with figures from the Pope to the President of France, this government still refuses to heed this call, ignoring the 76% of the British public who back it. And beyond this immediate need to end the bloodshed, Britain, of course, has a historical responsibility to push for a just and lasting peace, having been the mandatory power in Palestine during the 1948 Nakba. So as we witness a new and even more terrible Nakba, Britain must honour this duty, demanding an immediate ceasefire and ending arms sales today, and insisting on ending the illegal occupation and for a free Palestine tomorrow. Mr. Chairman, Israel's war in Gaza is not the first time British-made weapons have been used for war crimes, but it must be the last. So I will conclude with these questions to the Minister. Given the overwhelming evidence that Israel has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, what assessment has the government made of Israel's conformity with international law? Has it made any assessment of this? And if it hasn't, will the government commit to immediately making this assessment? Given the overwhelming evidence that Israel has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, what assessment has the government made of Israel's action in light of our export licensing criteria? Again, has it made any assessment of this? And if it hasn't, will the government assess if Israel's actions are consistent with our export licensing criteria as it stands? And finally, I ask, Will the government uphold our export licensing rules? Will it uphold international law? And will it uphold basic principles of humanity and immediately suspend arms sales to Israel? I look forward to the Minister's reply, and I thank everyone who's joined us here today for this debate.
The question is that this House has considered arms export licences for sales to Israel. Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher. It's a pleasure, as always, to serve under your chairmanship, and can I thank the honourable member for Coventry South for bringing this debate here today. Hamas's barbaric attack on Israel on the 7th of October featured unspeakable acts of brutality and sexual violence. And the attack left 1,200 dead and thousands injured, and the bodies of many victims remain unidentifiable due to the severity of the violence. And Hamas chose to break an existing ceasefire the day it launched the heinous genocidal attack. And it says acts of terrorism haven't ceased since, with more than 12,000 rockets now indiscriminately launched at Israel since the 7th of October. I will give way.
Israel is fighting a war that it did not want and it did not start against an enemy who shows complete and utter disdain for its own civilian population by embedding its terrorist infrastructure in schools, hospitals and mosques. Does my honourable friend agree that Israel has a legal right to defend itself and to remove the grave threat posed by a terrorist organisation whose stated aim is to wipe it completely from the world map?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He is, of course, absolutely right. Israel does have the right to defend itself, and I would argue that the biggest threat to the Palestinian people is not from Israel, but from Hamas itself, and this is something that we must also bear in mind. And I will give way.
Is the death toll of 17,000 in Gaza defence?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is the death toll of 17,000 in Gaza defence?
I think it is very important when anybody is taking any sort of action that civilians are protected. And as with all wars, there are casualties. And I wish Hamas had borne this in mind when they started this and when they broke the ceasefire in the first place. However, what I would do is, with any action that is taken, that we protect civilians, that there are safe routes, that there are those humanitarian pauses, and we can make sure that we save as many lives as possible and prevent this from happening. So I do take my honourable friend's point there. I think it is important that with both sides in this case that we do minimise casualties, we encourage that, and we do encourage a long-standing peace. I do take his point that, of course, there will be casualties on both sides, and that is something that we, of course, do want to avoid. But it's also been very publicly boasted of the intention to repeat the attack again and again, and we have 137 hostages who are remaining cruelly within Hamas's control, with the group using them as a sickening bargaining chip. And no democratic state can be expected not to act in self-defence when faced with such an existential terror threat. And I applaud the UK government for resolutely supporting Israel's duty to its citizens to remove the threat posed by Hamas. But like everybody in this place, I do hope for a just and lasting peace in the region, which is why I believe that the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, was right to say last week that if we leave Hamas in charge of even a part of Gaza, there will never be a two-state solution, because you cannot expect Israel to live next to a group of people that want to do October the 7th all over again. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady first and then the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank him for giving way. He has mentioned Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. My honourable friend there said there's 18,000 civilians defence. I would add there's 6,000 children defence. Now we have a situation where we've got 800 experts in genocide are saying that this could possibly be a genocide against the Palestinian people. How can we continue supporting it? Because if we do continue supporting Israel in their bombardment of Gaza, we are complicit in this genocide.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, but I think it is wrong to imply, as this debate appears to, that Israel alone is responsible for the current situation that is in Gaza. And Hamas has ruthlessly controlled Gaza now for almost 2 decades and has inflicted a great amount of suffering on the civilian population there, and it has also deliberately prioritised this genocidal terrorism with direct support for the Iranian regime. And Israel did not seek this war. It hoped wrongly that Hamas was moderating itself and more interested in governing the Gaza Strip. This does not appear to be the case. I take the honourable gentleman's intervention.
Israel's stated aim in this conflict is the destruction of Hamas, and the UK and US governments have given them a blank cheque in order to achieve that aim. I haven't met one serious expert who believes that the destruction of Hamas is possible. So how many deaths is it actually going to take before the UK government closes their chequebook to Israel?
Well, I disagree with my honourable friend that a blank cheque has been provided. I think if you look at the comments from the Foreign Secretary, the former Foreign Secretary, we have spoken with our international partners there, and we are very keen to see that two-state solution. This means working with Palestinians as well, and with Hamas, again, as I said, the biggest enemy to the Palestinian people is Hamas, and we want to work together to make sure that we can finish this as soon as possible and move on now. I'll take the right honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. He talks about Hamas as the biggest threat to Israel. But wouldn't he acknowledge that actually Hezbollah, to the north of Israel, with its up to 130,000 rockets, is probably more of a threat to Israel? And would he also acknowledge that we have to look at the bigger geopolitics here? This is a proxy war that is being fought with Hamas as one combatant and many, many civilians as the poor, unfortunate victims of this war.
I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point there, and yes, with the Hezbollah situation, that is absolutely correct. This is from several different sides. I mentioned Iranian involvement there, and there are a number of people who just simply do not want peace in this region. It is not in their interests, whether that's funding certain groups such as Hezbollah, such as Hamas. Israel, of course, we're looking at a deal with Saudi Arabia, including relations there. So he is absolutely right. The geopolitics of this are also important, and we must not look at Israel and Gaza purely in isolation. So I do thank him for making that excellent point. I do agree with him on that, and I think that is something that we also need to continue to focus on. But the approach to Hamas has proved misguided so far and has shown the world the true brutal face of the organisation. So I believe calls for an arms embargo against our democratic ally is deeply wrong. And all the more so in the absence of clear calls for Hamas, of course the instigator and belligerent in the situation, to surrender unconditionally. So my right honourable friend, the Minister, will be aware that the UK has long benefited from the Israeli military's technology, and every day this protects the lives of many British soldiers. As an example, we have Israeli-made battlefield medical technology. We have techniques for dealing with suicide bombers and technology to counter the remotely detonated terrorist bombs, and these have all been used by the British Army to save lives. And Israeli drone technology, such as the Watchkeeper WK-45, has also been used by British forces in Afghanistan for intelligence collection, and the Skysaber missile defence system now protects the Falklands Islands. And this uses technology which is behind Israel's Iron Dome system. So it is worth noting that the Iron Dome has saved the lives of countless Israelis in recent weeks, and it has also played a major role in the conflict not spiralling further, which is, of course, something that we also want to make sure that we ensure. But the 2030 roadmap that has been signed by the UK and Israel is very welcome. It does highlight further bilateral defence cooperation, which will save the lives of British service people for many years to come. And simply an arms embargo would jeopardise this invaluable cooperation. And it's also worth noting at the outset that the UK already operates, as has been mentioned, the world's most robust export licence controls, and this is underpinned through strategic export licence criteria, which upholds the UK's obligations under international law. The UK's defence exports to Israel are also relatively small, it is worth bearing in mind, and this is just 42 million a year, I believe, 42 million last year. So much of its component parts are not used by Israeli forces in Gaza. So calls for an arms embargo on Israel is part of the wider boycott campaign, which the UK government has resolutely rejected, and it is harmful and divisive must be given no truck. And I call on the Minister to restate this commitment today. Thank you, Sir Christopher.
John McDonnell.
Me. Thanks, Chair. Thank you. There's lots of people want to speak. I'll try and be as brief as possible. I want to ask a number of questions, but just as a preface to this, when you've been in this House long enough and sat through the discussions about the various wars taking place, you do get an understanding of the nature of war and the nature of war crimes legislation. Whatever Hamas did, whatever people think, it was a war crime, and we've condemned that absolutely. But we create legislation globally after the Second World War to determine how states could legally react to war crimes like that. And Article 8 of the Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court, specifically designated war crimes, in particular the use of weapons which were indiscriminate in their impact, i.e. that affected civilians. Secondly, the denial of the basic resources to survive for civilian populations in particular, and that's the food, heat, and in terms of water. And the third element of war crimes under Article 8 was the forced displacement of people from their homelands. I'm afraid what we're seeing, whatever people think of what's happening in Gaza at the moment, these are war crimes according to the Rome Statute by any definition, but certainly on those 3 points. And therefore, that's how we guide our reaction to activities by any state, whether it's Israel or Saudi or whoever. And in guiding our behaviour, we have to recognise that if we in any way aid or provide support to a state acting in that way, we become complicit in those war crimes. And that's the reality of where we are at the moment. I feel for the reputation of our own country for the future about the current behaviour of our government. Now, there was a letter written, and I want to raise the questions, because that was the letter written from 3 key organisations: Asad Rahman, the Chief Executive of War on Want; Katie Fallon, the Director of Advocacy of the Campaign Against the Arms Trade; Sasha Dexmus, the Chief Executive of Amnesty International; and Yasmin Ahmed, UK Director of Human Rights Watch. I want to raise very briefly some of the questions that they've raised. First of all, whether or not the actual Minister has seen the letter itself, because what it does, it calls for an immediate suspension of the extant licences and new export licences to Israel, given the clear risk in their view that the component parts that are being transferred from the UK might be used to commit or facilitate violations of international law, and that includes what they believe actions that are tantamount to war crimes. So the question from these organisations is, will the government now suspend those licences? Secondly, does the government know, are British weapons or military equipment being used in Gaza? We've heard from the one backbencher that they are, but or not. It's noting that in the past, when the UK has admitted it's supplied equipment, and it's been admitted that it's been used by the Israeli Defence Forces during hostilities in Gaza in 2009, Lord Cameron then introduced a procedure to suspend the operation, and there was a complete review of what was happening with regard to the weapons that we'd supplied. I think the minimal we should be asking for now is the government to undertake a Lord Cameron-type review to see exactly how what we've supplied is being used and whether it is being used in Gaza, because if it is, I'm afraid we do become complicit in the war crime itself. The other question they've asked is just what monitoring is taking place by the government? What mechanism is in place that is effectively monitoring what's going on? And the further question that's asked is, on what basis does the government consider that there's no clear risk that arms licensed to Israel will be used in prohibited conduct, as identified, as my honourable friend has said, in the strategic export licensing criteria? And again, it goes back to the fact that the government has warned in the past that if any of these weapons are used in this way, they will suspend the licence overall. Again, has the government even taken that into consideration? Can I also say, one of the questions we've asked consistently as this has gone on, the 474 million that's been provided to Israel, is whether or not actually the government did apply the restrictions that we call for, which prevents the use in the occupied Palestinian territory or against Palestinians. Because At least in those instances, we could accept that we were providing sufficient support to Israel to defend itself from external attack, but to allow these weapons to be used in the occupied territories means it was going to be used against Palestinians, or indeed some of the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens as well. Final question really is to ask the government, have there been any shipments of spare parts from UK to Israel for UK supply components for Israeli F-16 and or F-35 aircraft? Because as has been said, it is these aircraft that have been used in the indiscriminate bombing of Palestinians in Gaza, and has cost such a civilian loss of life. Briefly, because I'll wind up.
Does he not think an additional question might be what is carried in these RAF planes that are leaving RAF Akrotiri and apparently flying directly to Israel?
Well, that's why I'm asking the question, because the key component parts to those planes could be used, therefore, in the bombing of Gaza and the huge loss of life. And I reiterate what others have said. I find it difficult to participate in these debates without becoming extremely angry or extremely emotional on all sides, both in terms of wanting the release of the hostages, but also that 7,000 children have now died. That cannot be right, and I believe it is a war crime. And anything that we're doing to give any aid or comfort in this direction, I think will ensure that we will be condemned in the long-term future. Final point from me. A number of us met with Yashad today, and we met with heroes and heroines from Palestine, Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, and what they're trying to do is campaign for peace. And one of the clear demands that they, as part of their heroic campaign, is for a ceasefire, so that actually we can release the hostages and at least plan for the future in peace.
Before calling the next speaker, this debate has to have this wind-up starting at 3:30, so that means the demand exceeds the supply, and I'm going to impose a 3-minute time limit. Afsana Begum.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I thank the Honourable Friend the Member for securing this debate and everything she does and is doing in the pursuit of justice and human rights. As she has laid out, not only is Israel a major recipient of UK weapons, but UK weapons manufacturers are seeing enormous increases in stock prices. For example, BAE Systems stocks increased by 11.7% just between 7th of October and the 24th of October. In addition to the value of official UK arms exports to Israel, commentators have noted a number of other forms of less public UK military assistance, and that this includes broader trade exploiting the incorporation guidelines loophole. So why is this significant? As has been mentioned already, according to the Palestinian Ministry for Health, 18,825 Palestinians have been killed since the outbreak in October. In fact, we know that the real number is much higher. And just to put this into perspective, Ukraine and Sudan are both widely understood to have unacceptable levels of civilian deaths across the international community. The levels of slaughter in these areas have rightly been condemned as horrendous and horrific. On the 21st of November this year, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine said in a press release that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, at least 10,000 civilians, including more than 560 children, have been killed. The United Nations also reports that more than 10,400 people have been killed in Sudan since April 2023. Again, I repeat, these are disgracefully high levels of civilian deaths and should be condemned outright. I also repeat that according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, 18,825 Palestinians have been killed since the outbreak in October, around 20,000 in around 2 months, and the vast majority of these are not combatants. Israel is increasingly using its acceptable collateral damage threshold, so hundreds of civilian casualties are acceptable to eliminate a single target. And of course, one of the simplest ways to explain this is that the death toll includes the frightening numbers of children that we are seeing. Gaza, in the words of the United Nations Secretary General, is a graveyard for children. A graveyard for children. What a terrible, terrible thing. Within weeks of the outbreak, Save the Children highlighted that the number of children killed in Gaza has surpassed the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones since 2019. Therefore, as we know, there are widespread concerns that war crimes crimes against humanity and breaches of international law are continuing to take place. We are... Yes, I will give way.
Can I congratulate her? She is actually making an exceptional speech, but does she agree with me, given the humanitarian catastrophe, we've highlighted over 18,000 people have died, including thousands of children. If the UK are found to be arming Israel and not ceasing to do so, they would absolutely be complicit in this war crime.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I completely agree with her. We are bearing witness to this unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. It is there before us. And so we have a right to know how many Palestinians were slaughtered using UK-made weapons, how many children were dispatched using UK-traded armaments, how many women have been slain by ammunition from the UK, how many schools, hospitals and refugee camps have been annihilated with the help of UK engineering, how much profit is being made from death, destruction and war crimes, and yes, what is the government's price tag for humanity? We are told that the UK's arms export system is based on the principle of avoiding a clear risk of British weapons being used to commit serious violations of international law.
To serve under your chairship. I want to talk today about parliamentary scrutiny of these arms transfers to Israel, because I think the current system is somewhat lacking. I mean, it's a very good attendance today, and it's excellent that lots of honourable and right honourable members wanted to come to this one, but frankly, we don't debate arms transfers very often in this place. And I think one reason is because we assume that select committees are all over this. And I suggest to you that is not the case. My own contribution today is shaped by having worked at the University of Oxford immediately before getting elected last year on export controls and preventing Oxford research from falling into the hands of adversaries. But as well as being shaped by that and constituents' opinions, it was also shaped by being bombarded by Iranian rockets, and I should say the difference, I would say, between that personal experience and the one that is being experienced in Gaza by many Gazans at this time is that I had the protection afforded to me of a counter-rocket and a counter-rocket system not dissimilar to the Iron Dome that afforded me sufficient protection. The same is clearly not being said right now about the air attacks and the artillery attacks that are going on in Gaza today. Liberal Democrat policy in this area is quite straightforward. We believe that arms exports should not be taking place to countries that are designated human rights priority countries by the FCDO. In 2021, the FCDO named Israel as one of those countries. In last year's report, in the 2022 report on human rights and democracy, Israel was slipped from the list and appeared instead under the occupied Palestinian territories entry into that register. But nonetheless, I'm of the opinion that Israel, as a state named in that list in 2022, should not be in receipt of UK arms. Very briefly, on the Committee on Arms Export Controls. This is a committee that is made up of members of 4 select committees, for international trade, foreign affairs, defence and international development. This committee has not met since March, and that is outrageous. We need to do something about it. I'm pleased to say that the committee chairs, 3 Conservatives, 1 SNP, 1 Labour, wrote to the Leader of the House and said, this system cannot go on. We need a standing committee to examine arms transfers, including to places like Israel. And the Leader of the House replied, essentially, there's no requirement for it. Now, I am quite certain there is a requirement for this. Otherwise, we wouldn't find ourselves in the situation today where the government has been caught out by transferring arms to a country that is most clearly in breach of human rights.
I thank my honourable friend, member for Coventry South, for securing this very important debate. A number of my constituents have written to me to ask me to speak in this debate and have asked me to use my influence to stop UK arms and military equipment being exported to Israel, as it may be used to facilitate or commit serious violations of international law, including war crimes. While the temporary pause of fighting between Israel and Hamas was welcomed, it is now over. Fighting and killing has now resumed again, and innocent Palestinians have been targeted the most with brutality, bloodshed, and war crimes. This is utterly condemnable and are clear violations of international humanitarian law. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have both reported on Israel's breaches of war crimes, and the International Criminal Court has echoed their concerns of the disregard for human life and the rule of law. More than 21,000 Palestinians have been killed, with 40% of those being children. 1.9 million people have been forcibly displaced, more than half of the population. This conflict is having a disproportionate impact on children and babies, and there is now a threat of starvation. We have to call this out now. I'm very concerned about our complicity in these horrors and have already joined the calls for supply of arms to Israeli government to be suspended, given that serious violations amounting to crimes under international law are being committed. I'm very clear today that I believe that this suspension should come urgently, because we don't want our weapons to be used against innocent Palestinians anymore. I also repeat my calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire by all parties to end this unprecedented civilian suffering, alongside the immediate release of all civilians and hostages. Thank you. I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. This week, we mark the 75th anniversary of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So does my honourable friend share my concern that we are speaking about the need to champion human rights while selling the very arms that are violating the human rights of millions of Palestinians?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I agree with this. And I'll finish on this point. This is the only way to prevent deepening the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza and give the space and time needed for us all to work towards a real, fair, enduring peace in the region.
Shannon.
Christopher, can I first of all thank the Honourable Lady for raising the topic. It is right and proper that we scrutinise our licensing procedures in line with our international obligations. We have a strong product in arms sales, and indeed Talis, on the border of my constituency, with a strong strengthened workforce, are world renowned for their tremendous products and their input into the local economy, cannot be emphasised enough. With a 30-year heritage in world-class engineering, employing 500 people, with a 77 million contribution to Northern Ireland's GDP, and also an ecosystem of suppliers. 91% of our local procurement in Northern Ireland is to small to medium enterprises. That's the background for the arms sales and the importance of it, which the Minister, I know, understands. Belfast has developed into a centre of excellence for Talis air defence and surface attack solutions. Talis have made a real difference in the war in Ukraine, and their product has been mentioned positively in this House for being a tool for Ukraine to beat back the Russian invasion. The sale of these products have been essential to the war effort in Ukraine. Israel was attacked on the 7th of October, and their war against terror is ongoing. It is my belief that they are operating under international law, and as such our arms sales can and should continue. Government responses to those questions. The Honourable Lady for St Albans asked a question, and the Government Minister responded. The UK Government takes its defence export responsibility extremely seriously and operates some of the most robust export controls in the world. All applications for export licences are assessed on a case-by-case bias against strict criteria. The UK Government continues to monitor closely the situation in Israel and the OPTs, and if extant licences are found to be no longer consistent with the criteria, those licences will be revoked. The Minister for Business, Trade and Investment also said on the 30th of November 2023, since the barbaric terrorist acts by Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October and the subsequent conflict in the region, the government have been monitoring the situation very closely. The UK supports Israel's legitimate right to defend and take action against terrorism, provided that it is within the bounds of international humanitarian law. Export licences are kept under careful and continual review as standard, and we are able to amend licences or refuse new licence application if they are inconsistent with the strategic export licence criteria. Quite clearly, government set the course. I support government in this view. I know the benefit of arms deals to my local economy. I see the benefit of the product in the war in Ukraine, and I stand with Israel whilst they legally fight this war on terrorism within the realms of international law. Sir Christopher, thank you.
Simone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Christopher. I'd like to thank the
Coventry South for securing this important debate and for her powerful opening speech. I will start by paying tribute to my constituents who have been calling for a peaceful settlement in Gaza. More than 2,000 of them have contacted me since the war began, and many of them are families who have gone out in support of those suffering in Palestine. Sadly, I believe the UK government is instead complicit in the mass slaughter in Gaza, as well as the ongoing ethnic cleansing in West Bank. The government is aware that MPs have raised concerns about arms exports before and during the current conflict. Only on the 30th of November 2023, the Secretary of State for Business and Trade said in her response, export licences are kept under careful and continual review as standard, and we can amend licences or refuse new licence applications if they are inconsistent with the strategic export licensing criteria. So to my understanding, if there is a risk arms exports may be used in internal repression or breaches of international law, or the arms may threaten regional peace and security, then those licences can be revoked. It is really clear. It's quite clear that these benchmarks have been met. The Secretary of State has it within her power to instruct the Export Control Joint Unit, who is responsible for processing licence applications. For clarity, this unit sits within the Department of Business and Trade, and it draws expertise from FCDO and MOD to look at clear breaches. Why is this not being acted upon? Only this week, Omar Bartov, he is an Israeli-born historian. He's a professor of Holocaust and genocide at Brown University. He warned the following: Israel has been conducting a war for weeks and weeks, which has killed thousands and thousands of Palestinians. It has moved those people from a very small part of the Gaza Strip and has destroyed their properties and has not made a commitment to allow them to go back and to return. And this has been done with the support of the US and the UK supplies. We need a peaceful solution. We need the government to stop being complicit in the murder and the movement away from people's homes into a space where there is no humanitarian hope, there is no space for them to live, and they are dying. We have children, the numbers have been quoted, loads of children have died. We need to stand up and we need to actually be critical of the friend that the UK government says they are with Israel and actually point out where they are clearly in breach of international law. Thank you.
That the mover very eloquently said. Equally, I think in the time left, the limited time, I want to comment on the issues that's been raised by others, which is complicity, because that can be directly or indirectly, and the mover, as I say, very eloquently dealt with the direct. The indirect has obviously been touched upon by the member for Islington North. If we are facilitating the supply of weaponry to Israel by the Americans flying out of RAF Arcatiri, it is simply unacceptable and we are complicit. Not only does the Republic of Cyprus government have a right to know what is happening at a sovereign UK airbase, so do the citizens of the United Kingdom, and so we need to know that there is no complicity there. The second part, because I'm conscious of time and others coming in, is that we have, according to a parliamentary question, been giving military aid to Israel, but it's been restricted to medical supplies. Now, that on its own sounds very grand, that only since 7th October have we given medical supplies. But this isn't the vaccinations for children. It's not hip replacements for the elderly. It can only be described as medical aid for combat trauma. The equipment that is itemised in Parliamentary Answer 5416 is something that isn't going in to an Israeli sitcom version of MASH. It isn't something funny. It's being used by Israeli soldiers who are killed or injured in the Gaza Strip. Now, I wish no one ill, not an Israeli soldier, nor indeed a Palestinian civilian. But we should not be supplying equipment that can only be described as for combat, because that, by the broadest sense of the imagination, cannot be described as humanitarian aid. It is aid to the Israeli military. It is aid to comfort their soldiers, and they require comfort, but they shouldn't be doing it, and we shouldn't be supplying it.
Hey, Ali.
I also thank the member for Coventry South for securing this debate today. The Palestinian human rights organisation Al-Haq, alongside with the Global Legal Action Network, have recently applied for a judicial review of the government's export licences for the sale of British weapons to Israel. According to these organisations, since 2015, the value of British arms export to Israel as part of the standard licence grants stands at around £474 million, with 58 open licences for the arms trade with Israel. Existing criteria for assessing the suitability of arms export states that where there is a clear risk that any weapon may be used in violation of international humanitarian law, then no licence should be granted. Now, it is abundantly clear to me and others, hundreds of thousands of people across the UK would agree that there is more than clear risk that Israel is using these weapons provided by the UK to commit atrocious crimes against Palestinian people. Many people in this country and around the world would suggest, and I would agree with them, that it is both clear and certain that Israel is using weapons to commit war crimes against Palestinian civilians, and that the UK, in providing such weapons, is complicit. It should bring shame on us all that our government, in providing arms, has been complicit in such horrendous acts of violence and cruelty. Therefore, I'm here to echo the demands of my constituents that Israel should receive no weapons or arms of any kinds from the UK government, and that the government should act to stop the conflict and work to restart the peace process now. No, I wouldn't, because many others are still waiting to speak as well. Could the sale of arms be a condition from Israel for the UK government from abstaining at the Security Council? Could the sale of arms be a condition from Israel for not recognising Palestine as a state by this government? Could the sale of arms be a condition from Israel for not demanding a ceasefire? Can the Minister explain?
With him.
Thank you, sir. The Israeli assault on Gaza has endured for over 2 months and there's no end in sight. The atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October were truly horrifying, and I know that I speak for every member of this House when I say that such appalling acts cannot be justified. Neither do they give the Israeli military the licence to indiscriminately kill Palestinian civilians in retaliation. The IDF admits that civilians constitute 2/3 of its victims, but the real proportion is likely to be much higher, given that around 70% of those killed are women and children. Gaza has become a graveyard of children and parents, of infants and elderly people, of doctors, journalists and poets, of thousands upon thousands of innocent people who simply wanted to get on with their lives in peace.
Yes. I thank my friend for giving way. She quite rightly, as others had, focused their comments on the situation in Gaza, the horrific situation in Gaza. But when I visited the West Bank earlier this year, the rate of murders, violent attacks and intimidation by illegal settlers was already on the rise, with the IDF too often either refusing to intervene or even protecting the attackers. So since the heinous attack on October the 7th by Hamas, the death toll has reached intolerable levels in Gaza and the West Bank. On this side, we're very clear that arms export licences should only be granted in circumstances where there is no risk that they could be used in contravention of international law. So does she agree with me that it's essential for ministers...
This is an abuse of an intervention.
Apologies, Sir Christopher.
Nadia with him.
Does she agree with me that...
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Nadia with him.
I completely agree with the point that my honourable friend makes. It's not only bombs causing death and despair in the Strip. 9 in 10 people in northern Gaza have gone a full day and night without eating. Doctors are heroically battling to save lives with no anaesthetics, antiseptics or even clean water for their patients. The World Health Organization has warned that untreated diseases caused by the siege and the resulting collapse of healthcare could claim even more lives than airstrikes. This humanitarian catastrophe is not a result of some natural disaster. It's the intended consequence of the actions of the Israeli authorities, actions that our government still can't bring itself to condemn. And not only that, Israeli ministers are openly calling for a second Nakba, while our government continues to licence arms sales to the Israeli government. Last night, I was honoured to host in Parliament representatives of Standing Together, a movement of Israeli Jews and Palestinians united for peace, justice and human rights. One of its organisers, Uri Veltman, wanted to send this message to our Prime Minister.
that standing with the Israeli people is not the same as standing with this violent, hard-right Israeli government. Bombing hospitals and starving children will not bring peace to Israel and Palestine. We must immediately suspend the sales of arms to the IDF and end the UK's complicity with Israeli government's war crimes. I called for this in 2021, and when Gaza was once again under attack, and it's even more urgent now. We must demand an immediate ceasefire, the unconditional release of hostages, and the lifting of the siege. And we must push for a proper peace process, working towards a just, lasting solution that protects the safety, rights, and self-determination of the people of both nations.
I'm afraid we can't take any more backbench speeches. And so it's Martin Doherty-Hughes, please, to wind up.
Thank you, Chair. It's good to see you. Let me be clear, the barbarous attacks on October 7th have no justification whatsoever, and Hamas is a terrorist organisation and a death cult, and it should release all the hostages immediately before being prosecuted as the war criminals they are. Furthermore, the Scottish National Party agrees wholeheartedly with the right of Israel to defend itself. It is the very basis of sovereignty of international relations. What should not have to be said, however, is that that right to self-defence should be in accordance with international law or even the most basic aspects of our common humanity. Concepts around collective punishment and the treatment of prisoners in wartime are not what those on the government benches might speak about on GB News, Chair. As the preserve of the Islington set, they've been central to the very idea of human rights and the correct prosecution of a just war for as long as these concepts have existed. So it will be no surprise, I hope, to hear that those of us in the SNP have no compunction with supporting the aims of this debate today, and we thank the member for Coventry South for bringing it. Before going on to the substantive reasons for this, I'd like to briefly touch on the most under-examined aspects of this conflict, and that is its intersection with the tedious and self-defeating debate on immigration in this political state, which the government seems intent on taking up more time today. We've had months of confected rage at the government benches about desperate people trying to cross the channel in flimsy boats without really interrogating many of the reasons why they find themselves in that position. To think about the numbers of global conflicts that have caused instability and forced large numbers of people to flee, be it Syria, Afghanistan or Ukraine, and the way in which these flows of people can be an opportunity for both people traffickers ready to profit on human misery, or indeed on a broader level, a potential for leverage by our geopolitical opponents to destabilise our democracies. You would think that a factor in this government's thinking would be not about facilitating the sort of actions that set these population movements in motion. As far as the people of Gaza actually have somewhere to go, Chair, to escape the bombing, it is to Egypt. And within Egypt, a part of the Sinai Peninsula that has only recently come back under the full control of the Egyptian government after Islamicist insurrection. This is the first potential domino to fall in a series that could see the return of the sort of instability that we saw in a country just over a decade ago. And if this government, and others I have to say across Europe, found the prospect of 20 million Syrians on the move across the Med problematic, just wait until we see that happening with 100 million Egyptians. Furthermore, these events do not take place in a vacuum, Chair. And I would beseech both the government and the opposition speakers who follow me to take proper cognizance of our inability to ensure our allies abide by international law in this instance will have a direct effect on how other states choose to approach their own obligations to international law in the future. And we may not like the results. Because, Chair, we know that while history may not always repeat itself, it certainly does rhyme. And I had not actually realised myself until recently the juxtaposition of the Suez crisis and the Hungarian uprising of 1956. The Soviet tanks poured into Budapest to...
I listened to the honourable gentleman patiently, and I was hoping he was going to start talking about arms exports to Israel. we've had to cut speeches short from backbenches because more people wanted to talk about that subject. So I'd be grateful if the honourable gentleman would now concentrate on the subject in hand.
It is part of the narrative, Chair, and as an opposition spokesperson, I do believe I have 10 minutes.
If you're challenging the Chair, I'm going to order you to resume your seat.
I'm not challenging Sir Christopher. I want to try to explore my own thinking on the very matter which you've asked me to come to, because I think it is critically important for the debate which the Honourable Member for Coventry South has brought today. And the reason I mention it is because the then government itself was desperate in relation to the decisions of the government taken in terms of the debate. The then government was desperate to accrue international support for its invasion of the Canal Zone. Now, we've all seen the repercussions of that, as opposed to actually supporting the people of Hungary. The difference between then and now, and this is important, Sir Christopher, is I'm afraid to say that it's unlike 1956. There is no serious difference of opinion between the government and the opposition leadership. No, not some of the members I see here today, I have to say.
Hold on. I'm going to resume his seat if he carries on about the Hungarian Revolution. I was at school with somebody whose father was served in the diplomatic service in 1956 in Budapest. And I'd love to talk about it, but that's not the subject of today's debate. I'm going to give the Honourable one more chance.
Well, Chair, let me sadly move on, because clearly I'm not being allowed to make the point that I wanted to make, but I'm sure many of the members can see the problems that the government and the official opposition leadership will find themselves. So let me sadly bring my points to a close by reiterating my and my party's position on these arms licences. And I'll be delighted to send on to any of my constituents, many hundreds, who actually emailed me about this issue, the full speech if they want to see it, most of which will be of no surprise to anyone here today. The United Kingdom government must do more than merely call on Israel to abide by international humanitarian law. They must be proactive in ensuring that no more innocent civilian lives are lost. The Israeli government's use of force has surpassed being legal and proportionate. There is a serious and pressing concern from the international community that states contributing to Israel's military front may be complicit in the breach of international law and the death of over 15,000 innocent Palestinian civilians. And as such, Sir Christopher, we are asking the UK government to cease extending arms licences to the State of Israel and to immediately halt the exploration of weapons or components, as has already been mentioned, to the State of Israel, alongside our calls for an immediate ceasefire, the recognition of the Palestinian state, and the support of the International Criminal Court's investigation into potential war crimes. But let's be clear, the United Kingdom will pay dearly for the moral equivalence its current policy entails. And while even the Labour leadership might not want to say it, we in the SNP are more than happy to remind the government of this fact. Violations of international law may a great wheeze to try and impress Daily Mail readers, but it has a habit of eating away at the state's international reputation like acid. And in this case, it is a great tragedy that the people of Gaza and others now involved in this conflict have to suffer so.
Thank you, Sir Christopher, and it's a pleasure to serve under you. Can I begin by thanking the Honourable Member for Coventry South for securing this undoubtedly important debate. I too, like many members, have received many emails from concerned constituents about this issue. As we all recognise, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire in the extreme. Following the horrific attacks of 7th October, more than 18,000 people have been killed in Israel's operation, and nearly 2 million people have been displaced. The scale of death and destruction seen over the last 2 months has been intolerable and truly appalling. And like so many members in this House from all sides, I am particularly heartbroken by the death of so many children. I've said many times that Israel has a right to defend itself from Hamas's attacks, but the right to defence is not an unqualified right. It is not a blank cheque. At all times, we on this side of the House have demanded that Israel act in accordance with international law. That requires acting in line with the principles of necessity, distinction, proportionality and precaution. Labour too also supports the independence of the International Criminal Court and recognises its jurisdiction over the conduct of all parties in Gaza.
the international community can and must push for a renewed cessation of violence and use that to make political progress towards what we all want to reach, an end of this conflict and a permanent ceasefire. Turning to the issue specifically of defence exports. I think it's important that we state clearly the incredibly important role that the UK defence industry plays in our economy. Our defence industry is rightly a source of pride across many communities in Britain. It helps to grow the economy, creates jobs, and it helps to keep our country safe. Let's remember that the UK defence industry supports 133,000 jobs in the UK. Many of those jobs are well paid and highly skilled. It is vitally important, in my view, that we retain and develop a defence domestic capability, a sovereign capability, rather than become over-reliant on others. The defence industry is vital to our national security and to equipping our armed forces and those of many of our NATO allies. It is only because of that defence what we can contribute to weapons for Ukraine, so that they're able to defend themselves against aggression. But at the same time, it is absolutely essential, in my view, that the defence industry is subject to a robust set of export controls, and Labour is equally clear on this point. That is the reasonable thing to do. Export controls help the UK ensure compliance of our international obligations, for example, under the Arms Trade Treaty. It also helps retain confidence in the UK's world-leading industry. Indeed, we believe the arms export regime should be strengthened with the aim of ensuring that it is transparent and fully committed to upholding international law. And I do agree the role of Parliament should be much stronger in that function. These rules...
Will the honourable member recognise that the UK has licensed over 470 million in arms sales to Israel since 2015, but the real number could be far higher because much of the sales volume is hidden behind open licences that allow unlimited exports that are not included in reported numbers. Indeed, according to the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, the value of defined value arms licences since 2015 is 560 million. When you talk about transparency, would you agree that the government actually needs to be more transparent about the arms licensing, because and be clear about the extent of arms licensing going on, because that exposure... Thank you.
I think the Honourable Member extremely well, and that proves why we do need transparency, because I cannot honestly respond to her question, because I don't know. I don't think anybody knows apart from the government. And I think that transparency is vital, and the scrutiny of Parliament is imperative that we have in the future. These rules, which we have, should apply consistently and equally to all countries. Now, in terms of Israel specifically, I note what the government has said, that no offensive military equipment has been delivered to Israel since the 7th of October. And it has previously said that it keeps relevant licenses under review. And it will not grant an export license because to do so would be inconsistent with the strategic export licensing criteria. Now, as the criteria states, UK arms exports should not be allowed if there is a serious risk that those arms are used for external aggression or internal repression. Now, I believe this is not only a moral issue, but it reflects the legal requirements the government is obliged to follow. These criteria include, as they should, stringent requirements in relation to international law. Under the export criteria, a license should not be granted if there is a clear risk that the items might be used to commit or facilitate internal repression or a serious violation of international humanitarian law. It's there in black and white. The government has also stated that it will take account of the risk that weapons might be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of violence against women or children. We've all seen our television screens. The concerns about Israel's conduct in this military operation are widespread across all sides of this House, and it has faced serious allegations from bodies including the United Nations and is the subject of an ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court. I believe this raises serious questions about Israel's compliance with the licence criteria, which the government has a duty to assess and address as part of any export process should these be sought. Can I therefore ask the government for a guarantee today that the export criteria will be applied vigorously and robustly to Israel, specifically in the light of the conduct of the conflict in Gaza? Sir Christopher, could I say in conclusion, as I've laid out, Labour supports our defence industry, but we also want it to be subject to vigorous export controls. Those should apply to Israel as to any other country. Those export controls must be vigorously applied, particularly in the light of the conflict in Gaza, about which all of us have such grave and profound concerns. Thank you.
Greg Hands, respond.
Thank you, Sir Christopher, and it is a pleasure to serve under you this afternoon. I'd like to start off by thanking the Honourable Lady, the Member for Coventry South, for bringing this debate. I'd also like to thank members for their contributions today. I will respond to as many of those points as I can in the time available. But first, I thought it'd be helpful to outline the government's approach to this issue. Sir Christopher, I think we've all been deeply moved by the scenes we have seen from Israel and from Gaza over the past 9 weeks or so. And at the same time, we must not forget where this conflict and how this conflict started. To do so would be a great injustice to the 1,200 victims of the Hamas terrorist attack on October the 7th. This is a massacre that has rightly appalled the world. Barbarism, brutality and inhumanity are not words that we should use lightly. But as more detail and witness accounts emerge of the events of that day, it is increasingly clear that they are apt descriptors of Hamas's wicked acts. Terrorism of this magnitude must be defeated. Israel has a clear right to defend itself, whilst of course complying with international law. Nonetheless, Sir Christopher, it is only right that we continue to engage with Israel to ensure its campaign is targeted against Hamas combatants and military infrastructure. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary stand alongside the international community in calling on Israel to ensure its actions in defence are necessary and proportionate. Of course. All is fine.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and the Minister will have heard honourable members detail the horrors rained down upon Gaza in the last few weeks. But can the Minister answer how many of the people who have been killed in Gaza were killed by arms supplied by Britain, and how many of the tens of thousands of bombs that have rained down on Gaza were supplied by Britain or dropped from planes where the parts were provided by Britain? And if the Minister says that he can't answer those questions that I've just posed, then surely that itself reveals why we need to suspend arms sales to Israel.
Well, thank you for that intervention, Sir Christopher. And it's not me as the Minister in the Department for Business and Trade to give a commentary on deaths or destruction, present up-to-date figures in Gaza, and those kind of things. That is rightly a matter for the Foreign Office. I think there was Foreign Office questions today, which would have availed him the opportunity to ask exactly those kind of questions. So we also urge, Christopher, all parties to make sure that aid continues to enter Gaza, to end settler violence, and work with international bodies such as the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yes, of course.
First of all, I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. But to the honourable member's point about the number of deaths that can be linked to UK arms sales, doesn't this point to how the Committee on Arms Export Controls isn't functioning if one minister can't talk to this subject which concerns 4 different departments of state?
Well, I thank him, and I heard his point earlier about the committee, and of course the government strongly supports there being good parliamentary scrutiny of our defence export systems. However, my understanding has been, since the machinery of government change back in February, that it has not been possible for the committee to meet, I think, since March. And that is most principally, as Christopher, a matter for Parliament, how it organises its scrutiny of government. The government stands strongly there to support scrutiny of defence exports. We've always been supportive of there being such a regime. So I'm going to make a little bit of progress. And we heard points about the situation on the ground from the Honourable Lady, the Member for Coventry South, the Member for Birmingham Hall Green, Nottingham East, East Lothian, and indeed many others. And the Foreign Secretary has been clear that Israel's actions must comply with international humanitarian law and take every step possible to minimise harm towards civilians. Of course, I'll give way.
Repeatedly saying that Israel must conform to international law. What assessment has the government made of Israel's compliance with international law and conformity? Has any assessment been made? And in light of Israel's actions, which consist of crimes against humanity, and how that is not consistent with our arms export criteria, what will the government do? These things just aren't matching up.
Sir Christopher, obviously we are monitoring the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories very closely, and we will take any action that the government considers appropriate as the situation develops. She mentioned the ECJU, and the ECJU is a place in an established process for responding at pace to changing conditions in a country where the UK has previously granted export licences and where those licences remain extant. So that situation is under constant review. However, Sir Christopher, the fact remains that Hamas could end this conflict today and stop the suffering of everybody, including the Palestinian people, whom they continue to endanger. Sir Christopher, I will now in turn explore some of the points raised in this debate in greater depth. First, it is correct that the UK's defence businesses have a trading relationship with Israel, and I welcome the official opposition's support for that, and the official opposition's support for our defence contractors and defence exports industry that he rightly pointed out, which I think was a helpful development from the current generation of Labour frontbench. But we should also put that trading relationship into perspective. In fact, our military exports to Israel are relatively small, representing just 0.02% of Israel's military imports overall. The 42 million figure quoted by the member for Coventry South and from the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Islington North, are figures released by the Secretary of State for Defence. We stand by those, and those are from 114 standard individual licences. The total accumulated from those licences is indeed 42 million. As members may be aware, a company wanting to export military or dual-use goods must apply for a licence from the government to do so. The applications for these licences are assessed on a case-by-case basis against the strategic export licensing criteria, a system which is among the most rigorous and transparent in the world and which provides a thorough risk assessment. I'm going to make a bit more progress because I've got a lot of points that have already been made still to respond to. And we can see this in practice. The member for East Ham is no longer in his seat. You can actually see this working in practice. It is a searchable database with the data released every quarter. I think the UK is actually at the forefront in providing transparency in our defence export and dual-use licences. And these reflect, and I'm going to make some more progress, among other things, the UK's obligations under international law and the potential for the goods to be used to commit violations of international humanitarian law. The final decisions, Christopher, on whether a licence lies with the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, who takes advice from officials in the Export Control Joint Unit, the ECJU. The ECJU is a combined unit, already been referred to, made up by subject matter experts and officials in DBT, the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Ministry of Defence. And it examines every application in great detail. The process examines a range of factors, including the political and security conditions in the destination country and the nature of the equipment to be exported. The unit comes to its conclusion by consulting both its UK experts and those in overseas posts. I'm going to make a bit more progress to respond to some of the points made. It also takes into account reports from NGOs, the media, and others. Chair, I must point out that the government takes the principles of responsible export control set out in the strategic export licensing criteria incredibly seriously. And we can and do respond quickly and flexibly to changing our fluid international circumstances, with all licences kept under careful and continual review as standard. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
In response to reports that the criteria may have been breached. In 2019, the then Foreign Secretary did that, suspended arms exports to NATO ally Turkey following their invasion of Syria. Why can't the government do the same now?
Well, she raises exactly the point I'm coming on to, Sir Christopher, which is to say that the system is designed so that due to changing circumstances, the proper assessment of those changing circumstances, it can lead to a change in policy. She mentioned the case of Turkey, but of course this has also happened in relation to Russia, in relation to Burma, in relation to Afghanistan, and indeed other countries. That is exactly why the policy is in place, to be able to respond quickly and flexibly to changing circumstances. And that means I'm going to make a bit more. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and he makes a good point that Hamas could solve this by removing themselves from their disastrous control of Gaza. But would my right honourable friend agree with me that if there are war crimes on any scale, then arms sales should then cease immediately, and that there should be a full and immediate ceasefire?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and of course we have set out in the criteria for the licences what the UK government policy and approach would be. If he has information in that regard, then I'm sure he will share that with the Foreign Secretary, with the Secretary of State for Defence, with us at DVT, and we'd be happy to have a look at it. But we do take our obligations in this space exceptionally seriously, and as I've shown before, we have acted to change policy in relation to changing circumstances on the ground. So, Sir Christopher, I'm going to move forward to deal with some of the points in the debate. I should add that the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office advises DBT on the situation in country and the risk this poses with respect to the UK's export control responsibility. DBT, I'm going to respond to the points already made, then decides whether to amend, suspend or revoke any relevant licence. So it is something that can be done to amend, suspend, revoke any relevant licence or to refuse new applications for licences. The Honourable Lady's private member's bill, which seeks to do, if I understood correctly, exactly that, is something that can already happen. So turning to some of the points raised, in terms of aid, the member for Coventry South, let me tell her that we've already doubled. The Foreign Secretary announced a doubling of aid from 30 million to 60 million, a tripling overall. My honourable friend, the member for Bassett-Law, made a very strong defence of Israel's right to self-defence and our wider cooperation with Israel. He and the member for Strangford asked me to restate our commitment to Israel, which I do. The member for Hayes and Harlington, who had some praise for Lord Cameron and how we've all performed some gymnastics, if you like, Sir Christopher, over the years, but it was good to hear that praise from him for Lord Cameron. I haven't personally seen the letter that he referred to, but our officials in the ECJU and the relevant ministers do engage with those groups all the time. On the suggestion he made, also made by the member for Bedford, we do continue to monitor the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories very closely, and will take any action the government considers appropriate. I will give way very briefly.
There are very specific questions in that letter from War on Want and the other agencies. Could he now write to us on the detail of the responses from the government?
Well, I thank you for that intervention. I'm happy to find that letter, see whether there has been a response. We at DBT, as a matter of course, respond to letters from NGOs. I will find out if a response has already been sent, and I will send a, well, if it's appropriate, I'm not sure if it's a private correspondence to them. I'd have to find their original letter. But I will make sure that it is responded to. The member for Poplar and Limehouse, speech rightly highlighting the suffering of the civilian populations in Gaza, which is, of course, under Hamas control. The member for Taunton and Honiton raised these points about re-establishing the committee. I think I've already answered that. And he claimed, if I might, Christopher, some tough Liberal Democrat policies in this space. But I remember when the Liberal Democrats actually ran this department for 5 years, in the coalition. I do not recall these tough policies he's talking about now actually being implemented at the time. No, I'm going to finish up. I've already taken an intervention from him. We've had the question from the member for East Lothian about medical supplies. If I understand it, those are defibrillators, those are boxes for blood supplies, pure medical supplies to Israel, but if he's welcome to ask those questions further if he needs any more detail on that. The member for Birmingham Hall Green, our position is to be supportive of Israel, but not due to defence exports, which I've already pointed out are of a very, very small quantity from this country, but due to our support for Israel's right to self-defend. Finally, the member for Caerphilly, for the official opposition, I didn't really detect any real difference in his position to mine. So I welcome Sir Christopher, the official opposition's support for the UK defence industry. He says it's world-leading. I agree. And he asked that we apply export criteria, apply vigorously and robustly, and that is exactly what we do. Finally, Sir Christopher, let me end by saying our hearts go out to everybody affected by the conflict in Israel and Gaza.
Order, order. Now move on to the next debate.